Have you ever really stopped to think about how much society has, well, completely shifted? Especially around things like family and even just how many people there are over the last couple of centuries.
It's pretty staggering when you look back.
Right. And what if some of the biggest changes we see today, the ones we talk about all the time, actually have roots going way, way deeper than we usually think?
That's often the case, isn't it? History has long shadows.
Exactly. So today we're going to do a deep dive into feminism's impact, society, family, and fertility from 18th century Europe right up to now.
And our source material is a collection of excerpts exploring just that, a really rich historical perspective.
Our mission really is to unpack this whole journey. Look at feminism historically and see how it connects sometimes in complex, maybe even paradoxical ways to the family, to marriage, to birth rates, all across Europe and beyond, actually.
We're tracing that path from these really rigid patriarchal societies to, well, where we are now with much more individual autonomy, but also these big demographic shifts.
Think of it as your way to get genuinely well-informed fast. We hope you'll find some surprising facts, maybe a few aha moments, on a topic that, let's face it, touches everyone.
Definitely.
So let's set the scene. Picture Europe in the 18th century. What does it look like?
Well, it's deeply patriarchal, for starters, very hierarchical, mostly agrarian societies.
And women's place in all that?
Legally, socially, economically, they were subordinate to men. Full stop.
And the family. Not like today, I imagine.
Not at all. Usually multi-generational, often rural. The family unit was the main place for, well, everything. Production, reproduction, the whole lot.
So marriage wasn't really about romance.
Generally, no. It was contractual, often arranged between families. Women were legally considered property, really, tied to their husbands or fathers.
And having children.
Seen as a duty, a civic duty, even a religious one. Motherhood was central to a woman's expected role.
And divorce.
Very rare. Or just plain illegal in most places. The church had enormous control over family life back then. But, even under that really rigid surface, things were starting to bubble up. Change was brewing.
The Enlightenment connection.
Exactly. Mid-1700s, you start getting these powerful ideas about liberty, equality, reason. These are the ideas that would eventually fuel feminist thought, challenging that whole structure you just laid out.
Okay, so the philosophical groundwork is there. But when did it burst onto the sort of political scene? The French Revolution seems key here.
Absolutely. Late 18th century, France is in turmoil. And right in the middle of it, 1791, you have Olympe de Gouges.
Tell us about her. What does she do?
She published the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, a direct challenge. She argued women should have equal rights, famously writing, "Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights."
Powerful stuff, but controversial, I gather.
Extremely. She was actually executed in 1793. Her views were considered just too radical.
So her immediate impact was cut short, tragically. But did her ideas take root?
They certainly planted seeds, crucial seeds for feminism in France and eventually elsewhere. It wasn't immediate, but the ideas were out there.
And that leads us into what we now call the first wave of feminism.
Right. Roughly from the 1830s up to the 1920s. And the main focus then was really about legal equality.
Like what specifically?
Things like property rights, a huge deal for women who previously owned nothing legally. Access to education. And, of course, the big one, suffrage, getting the right to vote. Big campaigns in Britain, America, and elsewhere.
So the first wave is fighting for these foundational legal rights. But as these rights start being won, how does that begin to interact with family life, with fertility? And how do those changes then shape what comes next for feminism? Let's try to trace that maybe decade by decade over the last century or so.
Yeah, it's a really useful way to see the parallels. If you look at the early 1900s up to the 1920s, that's when suffrage is being granted in the UK, the US, the Nordic countries.
And society then, family-wise?
Divorce was still pretty rare. The nuclear family was dominant. And fertility rates were high. Women often had, 4, 5, 6 children.
Okay, then moving into the mid-century, the 40s, 50s.
Right. You have World War II, women flooding into the workforce. But then, interestingly, a swing back to more traditional roles post-war.
And fertility, I always think of the baby boom.
Exactly. That era actually saw peak fertility, the baby boom, alongside very low divorce rates. Kind of counterintuitive, maybe.
So even with that wartime experience, traditional structures held strong for a bit. What started to really shake things up in the second half of the century?
Well, this is where the big shifts really kick in, the 1960s and 70s. Second-wave feminism gained serious momentum.
What were the key markers there?
Things like the birth control pill becoming widely available, a game changer. major pushes for abortion rights, strong advocacy for equality in the workplace.
And the societal shifts alongside that.
You start seeing a noticeable drop in fertility rates. Divorce rates begin to surge. And people start marrying later. That trend begins then.
Okay, so that takes us to the 80s and 90s. Third wave feminism. What was the focus there?
The third wave brought in more focus on identity, individual choice, and intersectionality.
Intersectionality, can you quickly unpack that?
Sure. It's basically the idea that different aspects of your identity, like race, class, gender, sexual orientation, they don't exist in isolation. They intersect and can create unique forms of discrimination or privilege.
Got it. And family trends during that time.
You see a continued rise in single motherhood, more diversity in what family structures look like, and fertility rates still declining.
Which brings us closer to the present, 2000s to now. Fourth wave.
Yeah, the fourth wave, often associated with digital activism, movements like Me Too, ongoing discussions about gender fluidity, autonomy.
And the societal picture.
Stark changes, marriage rates plummeting in many places, a really severe fertility crisis hitting parts of East Asia and Europe especially hard. And alongside that, a big rise in using technologies like IVF and egg freezing.
You mentioned that surge in divorce rates back in the 60s and 70s. That sounds like a really pivotal moment. What was going on legally and culturally to make that happen so fast? It was so different before then.
It really was a dramatic shift. Before the 1960s, like you said, divorce was tough legally and carried a huge social stigma.
Right.
Then, post-1970s, you see the spread of no-fault divorce laws. That made it much, much easier.
No fault meaning.
Meaning you didn't have to prove adultery or cruelty or abandonment, things like that. If the marriage had irretrievably broken down, that was enough. And the impact was huge. The U.S. divorce rate, for instance, more than doubled between 1960 and 1980.
Wow.
Yeah. And similar liberalizing laws followed across Europe, Sweden in 73, UK reforms in 84, and so on.
Okay, so the laws changed. And you mentioned this coincides with a rise in single-parent households. What drove that specifically? Was it just the easier divorce or more than that?
It's definitely linked, but it's multifaceted. Easier divorce played a role, sure. But you also have greater female economic independence becoming a reality for more women.
So they could leave financially.
They had more options, yes. And culturally, there was a big shift, too. Marriage started to be seen less as an absolute necessity, more as a personal choice. Plus, the stigma around having children outside of marriage began to lessen significantly.
Let's look at the numbers there. Single-parent households.
In the U.S., back in the 1960s, it was under 10% of households. Today, it's over 23%. That's one of the highest rates in the OECD.
And similar trends elsewhere.
Yeah, you see similar patterns, maybe not quite as high everywhere, but certainly in the UK, Canada, parts of Scandinavia too.
Okay, so divorce is easier, single parenthood is more common. What about just the age people get married in the first place? Has that changed dramatically too?
Hugely. If you look at the U.S. again, just for clear data, 1950, the average woman married around age 20, men around 23.
Pretty young.
Very. Now, fast forward to 2020, women are marrying on average around age 28, men over 30.
That's a massive shift. What's behind that delay?
A lot of it is women prioritizing other things. First, things that feminism opened up. Higher education, establishing a career, personal growth. Marriage often comes later now. It's a consequence of that increased autonomy and opportunity.
Makes sense. But what are the consequences of that delay, especially thinking about having kids?
Well, the most direct consequence is biological, really. It shortens the potential fertility window for women,
Right.
which directly contributes to fewer children per woman overall. It also, unfortunately, correlates with rising rates of infertility.
And that connects to the rise in IVF you mentioned.
Exactly. Increased demand for assisted reproductive technologies like IVF and egg freezing is partly a result of this trend of delaying childbirth.
Are there other pressures?
Yeah, you can also see increased emotional and financial stress, potentially.
Sure.
Women trying to balance demanding careers, which might be peaking later in life, with starting a family also later in life. It could be a real juggle.
So all these factors, later marriage, easier divorce, changing roles, contraception, they all seem to point toward declining fertility rates globally. The numbers you mentioned earlier were quite stark.
They really are. Looking at that total fertility rate, the TFR average children per woman, the drop is dramatic pretty much everywhere in the developed world and increasingly elsewhere, too.
Let's revisit some of those examples. France.
France went from about 2.7 children per woman in the 1960s down to around 1.8 now, Still relatively high for Europe, but a big drop.
The U.S.
U.S. was way up at 3.6 or so in the 60s, baby boom peak, now down around 1.6, below replacement level.
Japan.
Japan dropped from about 2.0 down to 1.3.
And South Korea. That number was shocking.
Yeah, South Korea is the extreme case. Went from around 4.5 in the 60s to, well, the latest figures are hovering around 0.72.
0.72. That's less than one child per woman on average.
It's the world's lowest. Astonishingly low. Italy is also very low, down from 2.5 to about 1.2.
When you see numbers like South Korea's 0.72, what does that signal? Is it just demographics or something deeper societally?
It signals a massive demographic shift, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's often framed as a crisis. Sometimes even demographic collapse is used, particularly when talking about East Asia and parts of Southern and Eastern Europe. The implications are just so far-reaching.
Okay, so let's talk about those implications. It's easy to see the numbers, but what does this actually mean for societies? What are the broader economic and social repercussions? What are the costs?
The costs are significant and varied. First off, the most obvious one, a shrinking workforce.
Fewer young people entering the job market.
Exactly, which means a smaller tax base. At the same time, you have an aging population needing more support. That puts immense strain on pension systems, healthcare. It's a huge fiscal challenge.
Is immigration the answer there?
It's often proposed as an answer, or part of one, to fill labor gaps. But as we know, immigration is often very politically contentious, very polarizing, not a simple fix.
Okay, so workforce and fiscal strain. What about the economy more broadly? Does innovation slow down?
That's a real concern. Productivity and innovation could slow down. The thinking is that a population with a smaller proportion of younger, often more adaptable, perhaps more risk-taking individuals might innovate less.
You get these so-called silver economies.
Potentially, yeah. Where the economy becomes more geared towards serving the needs of an older population, perhaps less focused on the kind of dynamic, disruptive growth often associated with younger demographics and startup cultures.
And does it change, like the physical landscape, cities, housing?
Absolutely. You see shifts in real estate and consumer demand. Less demand for large traditional family homes, perhaps. Urban centers might become increasingly dominated by singles or childless couples. The whole pattern of consumption changes.
And beyond the economics, socially, mentally.
This is where it gets perhaps more personal, harder to quantify, but deeply felt. There's talk of a rising loneliness epidemic in many of these societies. Fewer children can mean fewer family connections, fewer intergenerational bonds.
Less social glue, maybe.
Could be. And you see phenomena like the rise of pet parenting, pouring resources and emotional energy into pets, or the growth of virtual companionship, AI companions, maybe filling gaps left by shrinking traditional family ties. Social fragmentation is a real concern.
Wow. So pulling all these threads together, it really does seem like a profound paradigm shift, but one with these, as you said, paradoxical consequences.
Exactly.
On the one hand, you have undeniable wins in terms of empowerment, right? Legal equality, freedom of choice for women, economic independence becoming possible, the end of widespread forced marriages, women reaching top leadership roles, huge progress.
Absolutely. Gains that few would want to reverse.
But then on the other hand, you have these consequences, maybe unintended, maybe just complex outcomes. Fertility collapsing in many places, societies aging rapidly that rise in loneliness and isolation, potential care gaps emerging, new kinds of emotional burdens.
It really highlights how societal progress, particularly something as fundamental as the shift in gender roles and the rise of individual autonomy, can have incredibly complex, sometimes contradictory results.
Oh.
It's not a simple good-bad narrative. It's a massive shift in how we organize ourselves.
It certainly is. Which leads us, I think, to the really big, maybe uncomfortable question facing modern societies, doesn't it? How do you hold on to the gains, the gender equality, the women's autonomy, things we value, while also somehow revitalizing the family unit, or at least finding ways to ensure demographic sustainability? Can you do both?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And governments, policymakers, societies are all grappling with it. You see lots of experiments trying to nudge things.
Like what? What are countries trying?
Well, you see direct pro-natalist subsidies, cash for kids, basically in places like Hungary, Poland, Singapore, trying to make it financially easier to have larger families.
Does that work?
The results are mixed. Often a short-term bump, but reversing long-term trends is hard. Then you have policies like really generous paid parental leave, like in the Nordic countries, trying to make combining work and family easier for both parents.
Other approaches.
Sometimes social campaigns trying to encourage earlier marriage or family formation, though that can feel a bit state-mandated. And increasingly, there's talk about relying on AI and automation to offset workforce losses, basically trying to engineer our way out of the demographic crunch.
No easy answers, clearly. It seems like a genuine dilemma with deep roots and far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with maybe a final thought to chew on after this deep dive. Can feminism and fertility ultimately coexist without this apparent contradiction? Or does society need to fundamentally reimagine both concepts for the future?
A profound question indeed. Lots to think about there.
Definitely. We hope this exploration gave you some valuable context and perhaps sparked some new questions for you to explore further on your own.